Speed is meaningless without orientation. John Boyle. If a system feels exciting, it's probably fragile. Excitement signals stimulation, not durability. Strategy stacking rarely comes from logic. It comes from boredom and the need to feel active. This video explains why boring systems compound and exciting systems quietly break. Speed is almost always framed as a virtue. Faster decisions, faster execution, faster feedback. In most modern systems, speed is treated as a proof of intelligence, competence, and edge. The assumption is simple. If you can move faster, you gain advantage. What almost nobody stops to examine is what speed actually does to a system once it is sustained. Speed is not efficiency. Speed is load. Every increase in speed increases the amount of stress placed on every layer of a system simultaneously. Cognitive load, emotional load, structural load, decision load. These loads compound, they do not distribute evenly, and they do not announce themselves clearly. Systems do not fail because they are slow. They fail because they are forced to operate faster than their capacity to regulate. This is the first misconception that needs to be dismantled. Speed does not simply make systems better or worse. Speed raises the minimum standard required for everything else to function. Precision must increase. Attention must stabilize. Emotional variance must shrink. Recovery windows must disappear. Any weakness that exists is no longer buffered by time. When systems slow down, they can absorb error. When systems speed up, they transmit error. Most people believe speed improves precision. In reality, speed increases the penalty for imprecision faster than it increases the ability to be precise. A small mistake in a slow system can be corrected quickly and quietly. The same mistake in a fast system propagates instantly. By the time it is noticed, it has already compounded. This is why speed feels powerful early on. Early speed produces engagement. It rewards responsiveness. It creates the sensation of being in control. But that sensation is deceptive. What often feels like control is simply constant intervention. The system stays active, not stable. Activity becomes confused with mastery. Fast systems demand something very specific from the operator: continuous regulation. They assume stable focus, consistent emotional neutrality, and uninterrupted judgment. That assumption is false. Humans fluctuate, attention degrades, fatigue accumulates, stress alters perception. Fast systems do not correct for this, they expose it. A slow system absorbs noise. A fast system amplifies it. Speed collapses the distance between stimulus and response. That distance is not wasted time. That distance is where filtering happens. It is where judgment overrides impulse. It is where systems protect themselves from overreaction. Remove that distance, and the system stops deciding. It starts reacting. This is not a discipline issue. No amount of willpower compensates for a missing buffer. Fast systems do not ask whether you are disciplined. They ask whether you are perfectly regulated at all times. No human is. This is why speed tests regulation, not intelligence. Intelligent people often fail faster in high-speed systems because they engage more, they intervene more, they respond more frequently. Each response feels justified. Collectively, those responses destabilize the system. Another hidden cost of speed is escalation. Fast systems create short feedback loops. Short feedback loops reward action, not restraint. Action becomes the default response to uncertainty. Restraint begins to feel like negligence, and over time, the system trains the operator to act even when action is unnecessary. This is where speed becomes dangerous, not because it causes reckless behavior, but because it slowly erodes the system's ability to not act. Speed also changes perception of control. In fast systems, control feels fragile. The operator feels constantly on. Vigilance becomes mandatory. The moment attention drops, the system feels exposed. This creates a false dependency. The system appears to require constant presence to survive. That dependency is a signal of poor design. Well designed systems do not require continuous supervision, they require strong constraints. Speed undermines constraints by bypassing them. Decisions are made before structure can assert itself. Exceptions are introduced faster than rules can be enforced. Over time, the system begins to oscillate. Oscillation feels like engagement, it feels dynamic. In reality, it is instability. Stability is boring, instability is loud. Speed rewards loudness. The most dangerous effect of speed is not visible during success. It becomes visible only when conditions change. When volatility increases, when uncertainty rises, when multiple variables move at once, at that point, fast systems reveal their weakness. They have no room for margin, no time to think, no room to pause, no way to slow down without collapsing. This is why speed based systems often appear dominant until the moment they fail. They do not decay gradually, they snap. Speed removes recovery time. Recovery is not optional, it is structural requirement. Systems that cannot recover cannot survive error, and systems that cannot survive error are not systems. They are gambles. The core truth of this section is simple but uncomfortable. Speed does not make systems stronger. It makes them more brittle. It raises performance when conditions are ideal and magnifies failure when they are not. In the next section, we will go deeper into how speed specifically collapses time horizons, how fast feedback destroys the separation between short term noise and long term structure, and why systems that cannot enforce temporal boundaries eventually sabotage themselves. Every system operates across time, whether it acknowledges it or not. Some decisions matter immediately, others only matter through accumulation. Some actions require responsiveness, others require patience. Healthy systems preserve these distinctions. Fast systems erase them. Fast feedback collapses time horizons. When feedback is constant, everything feels urgent. The system stops differentiating between what matters now and what matters later. Short term signals become dominant, not because they are more important, but because they are louder. Long term structure becomes abstract, distant, and easy to override. This is how systems lose coherence without changing strategy. People often believe they are still operating long term because their intent hasn't changed. Their behavior has. They monitor more frequently, they intervene more often, they react to information that was never meant to be actionable. Over time, the system shifts from being governed by design to being governed by updates. Fast feedback trains the nervous system, not the intellect. The nervous system responds to immediacy. It does not understand time horizons. It understands proximity. The closer feedback is, the more weight it carries. This is not a personal flaw, it is physiology. When systems deliver feedback rapidly, they force the operator into short term mode, regardless of stated objectives. Long term positions begin to feel uncomfortable, not because they are wrong, but because they are quiet. Silence is interpreted as risk. Movement is interpreted as information. This is where time horizon mixing begins. Long-term decisions start being evaluated with short-term metrics. Short-term fluctuations influence long-term conviction. The system begins to cross-contaminate logic. What should be independent timeframes bleed into each other. The system becomes internally inconsistent. This inconsistency is rarely recognized as structural failure. It is experienced as confusion, stress, or the feeling of doing too much. People describe it as mental overload or a loss of clarity. In reality, the system has lost temporal separation. Fast feedback also destroys learning. When outcomes update constantly, variation looks meaningful. Noise looks like a signal. The system starts overfitting to recent information. Adjustments become frequent and shallow rather than infrequent and structural. Each adjustment feels responsible. Collectively, they prevent understanding. And fast systems do not allow information to settle. They do not allow patterns to emerge. They force continuous interpretation. Interpretation under time pressure degrades quality. The system becomes reactive rather than adaptive. This is why fast systems often claim to be dynamic or adaptive, when in reality they are just busy. True adaptation happens at the level of structure. It happens slowly. Reaction happens at the level of stimulus. It happens instantly. Confusing the two is one of the most common design errors in modern systems. Another effect of collapsed time horizons is emotional amplification. When feedback is immediate, emotional response couples directly to outcomes. Wins feel larger, losses feel sharper. Not because exposure changed, but because feedback proximity intensified perception. Emotion begins riding the feedback loop itself. At that point, emotional regulation becomes continuous requirement. The system demands that the operator remain calm, detached, and rational at all times. This is not realistic. It creates a single point of failure: the human nervous system. Fast feedback environments do not merely expose emotion, they train it, they condition responsiveness, they reward action, they punish waiting. Over time, restraint begins to feel irresponsible. Patience begins to feel like neglect. This is how systems that were designed for long term outcomes end up optimizing for short term relief. Another subtle consequence of collapsed time horizons is loss of strategic memory. When everything updates constantly, the system forgets why decisions were made. Context erodes. Each new signal competes with accumulated reasoning. The system becomes present focused. Present focus feels adaptive, but in reality, it erodes continuity. Without continuity, systems cannot compound. They can only oscillate. This is why fast systems feel exhausting. They never resolve, they never settle. They require a constant attention because they never reach a stable state. Stability is deferred indefinitely. The most dangerous part is that none of this feels obviously wrong while it's happening. Fast feedback feels informative, it feels empowering, it feels like awareness. The cost is invisible until coherence is gone. By the time people recognize that their system feels chaotic, they usually blame themselves. They assume they need better discipline, better focus, better execution. The real issue is that the system no longer enforces time boundaries. Time boundaries are not preferences, they are structural safeguards. Without them, the shortest loop dominates. It always does. Short term signals override long term intent. Reaction overrides design. Control dissolves into responsiveness. This section exists to make one truth unmistakable. If a system does not explicitly protect long term structure from short term feedback, it will eventually destroy it. Not dramatically, quietly, through constant, justified intervention. In the next section, we'll resolve this at the meta level by explaining why control requires deliberate slowness, why durable systems intentionally slow down decision points, and why speed must always live below control, never above it. By now, the pattern should be unmistakable. Speed increases load. Fast feedback collapses time horizons. What remains to be addressed is the only real resolution. Control does not emerge from acting faster. Control emerges from deciding when action is not allowed. Control requires deliberate slowness. This is not a philosophical preference. It is a structural necessity. Every durable system in any domain, engineering, finance, biology, governance, introduces friction intentionally. Not everywhere, but precisely at the points where unregulated acceleration would cause collapse. Slowness is not inefficiency. Slowness is insulation. Insulation creates space between signal and response. That space is where filtering happens. Filtering is what prevents systems from responding to everything. Systems that respond to everything control nothing. They simply oscillate. Most people misunderstand this because they confuse slowness with hesitation. Hesitation is uncertainty. Deliberate slowness is certainty enforced over time. It is the difference between not knowing what to do and refusing to act outside design. Well-designed systems are fast only where speed is safe. They are slow where decisions alter structure, they delay review, and constrain changes that affect exposure, direction, or integrity. Speed is allowed only below these constraints, never above them. This hierarchy matters more than any individual decision. Speed below control is power. Speed above control is chaos. The reason this hierarchy works is that it separates intelligence from impulse. Insight is allowed to inform design. Execution is allowed to proceed within boundaries. What is not allowed is real-time rewriting of the system under pressure. This is where most systems fail. They allow discretion at the moment discretion is least reliable. They trust judgment precisely when judgment is most distorted. They assume that if something feels urgent, it must be acted on. That assumption is false. Urgency is often a symptom of missing structure. Deliberate slowness removes urgency from decision layer. Decisions that matter structurally are not made in response to stimuli. They are made in advance, when information can be weighted without pressure. This does something critical. It protects the system from the operator's internal state. Fatigue, stress, excitement, fear. These states still exist. Slowness prevents them from expressing themselves structurally. The system does not care how you feel. It cares what is permitted. This is why slowness increases freedom over time. When systems are governed, you do not need to monitor constantly. You do not need to intervene frequently. You are not required to be perfectly regulated at all times. The system absorbs variation. That is what stability feels like. Most people resist this idea because it feels restrictive. They fear that slowing down will cause them to miss opportunities. What they fail to see is that speed without control burns participation capital. It exhausts attention, it erodes judgment, it leads to overcommitment. Opportunity is meaningless if you are no longer able to act on the next one. Deliberate slowness preserves optionality by preventing overextension. It ensures that mistakes remain survivable. Survivability is the foundation of compounding. Systems that cannot survive error cannot compound. They can only spike. This is the deeper reason speed is seductive. Speed creates spikes. Slowness creates continuity. Another critical function of slowness is learning. When decisions cannot be reversed instantly, outcomes must be lived with. Patterns have time to emerge. Signal separates from noise. Learning becomes structural rather than reactive. Systems improve because they are allowed to observe themselves honestly. Fast systems never learn deeply. They only adjust superficially. They mistake movement for progress. They optimize for short-term relief rather than long-term coherence. Over time, they accumulate complexity without understanding. Deliberate slowness prevents this. It forces systems to confront the consequences of design choices. It removes the escape hatch of constant adjustment. What remains is clarity. This is where meta systems connect directly back to the control layer. The control layer exists to slow down what would otherwise accelerate uncontrollably. It enforces pacing, it defines authority, it prevents silent drift. It does not exist to suppress intelligence, it exists to protect continuity. Speed should never be the default state of a system. It should be earned, scoped, and constrained. Systems that assume speed as the baseline inevitably optimize for reaction rather than resilience. If there's one principle that governs everything discussed in this video, it is this. If a system requires you to be fast in order to survive, it is already broken. Durable systems survive because they are allowed to be slow where it counts. They do not rely on constant intervention. They do not depend on perfect regulation. They do not reward urgency. They enforce design. And that enforcement is what makes control possible. If any of that helps, down below the video in the description, you can find a test to the crypto quadrant and then access to CryptoOS, where the control layer can be implemented in your daily operations and help you navigate the crypto market based on your strengths, not weaknesses. I hope that helps. I will see you in the next one. Take care.